Thank you, Dennis. And I want to welcome our 2021 Global Insurance Fraud Summit attendees from around the world to our International Regulatory Panel. This year, the distinguished panel is going to be addressing the question and the topic literally that is so important around the world of data ethics and regulatory oversight. It's my privilege as Matthew Smith, the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud, to serve as the moderator for today's panel. And I'm now going to introduce our panelists, and as you will see, and as I read through their distinguished backgrounds, I'm really wondering how I got invited to be with such a distinguished group of worldwide leaders in this area of data ethics and data regulation. So let me introduce your panelists today. Joining us first is Francesca Rossi. She is the AI Ethics Global Leader with IBM Research. Francesca is an IBM Fellow, and as the Ethics Global Leader, she is a computer scientist with over 30 years of experience in the world of artificial intelligence research. She has published more than 220 articles in top AI journals and spoken at conferences. She co-leads the IBM AI Ethics Board and actively participates in many global multi-stakeholder initiatives on AI and specifically ethics. She is a member of the board of directors of the Partnership on AI and the industry representative in the steering committee of the Global Partnership on AI. She is a fellow of both the Worldwide Association of AI and the European Association. And next year, she will be the president of the Worldwide Association. Our second panelist is Holly Armitage. She is principal strategist with BAE Systems Applied Intelligence. Holly is a multiple award-winning data and technology strategist with extensive hands-on experience in strategy development in the private and the public sectors. She works with government and financial institutions supporting their strategic technology agendas. Before joining BAE, Holly held several senior leadership positions within the public sector as well. She is a fellow of the RSA, research manager for the Intelligence Network, and a committee member for Women in Data in the United Kingdom. Our third panelist is Commissioner Michael Conway of the state of Colorado in the United States. Michael Conway was appointed as Colorado's insurance commissioner by Governor Jared Polis on December 21st of 2018. And he was confirmed for that office by the Colorado State Senate. Might also add that he previously served as acting or interim insurance commissioner under the prior governor as well. As commissioner, Conway serves as the chief executive of the Division of Insurance and oversees the regulation of the insurance industry in the state of Colorado. His role brings together consumers, representatives of the insurance industry, and other stakeholders to create an inclusive, firm, and fair regulatory approach to all lines of insurance. Prior to his current appointment, Conway served as the Division of Insurance's Deputy Commissioner for Consumer and Compliance Services. In this time, he was instrumental in developing and guiding the division's strategies regarding health insurance in a very tumultuous time here in the United States. Before joining the insurance division, Mr. Conway was an assistant attorney general for the Colorado State Attorney General's office, where he represented the Division of Insurance in all facets of the regulation of the insurance industry. And rounding out our panel today is Shaheen Dill. She is Senior Managing Director at Protiviti, where she is focusing on advanced analytics. Shaheen has more than 35 years of experience in all aspects of analytics and also of risk management. That includes data management and validation, risk modeling and model validation, including compliance models, predictive modeling, and internal audit support for model risk management, as well as data and analytics. Previously, she was the global leader of the data and analytics solution for Protiviti. Prior to joining Protiviti, Shaheen was an executive vice president at PNC Financial Services Group. where she held various leadership positions, including head of risk analytics, leader of the Basel implementation program, head of model validation, chief performance officer, and head of the credit portfolio management division. She was elected one of 2011's top women in retail and finance by Women of Color magazine. She was also selected by Consulting magazine as one of 2014's Women Leaders in Consulting. She has published widely on risk and analytics topics and is a frequent speaker at conferences and industry associations. She holds a doctorate degree from Princeton University. So you can all see I was not in any way exaggerating when I talked about the quality of the International Regulatory Panel the Global Summit is pleased to present to you today. So Shaheen, since I introduced you last, I'm going to let you go first with the first question. And it's a really small one on the global stage. And that is, what are data ethics and how do we define that term? So that's about as broadly as we can start, but take it away, Shaheen.
Thanks. Thanks for giving me the easy one to start with here. Data today refers to any kind of recorded information. Most of the data we use are stored and accessed in digital form. And this is important as we get into the implications of this data, whether it's text, audio, video, still images, or media. And much of this data today refers to individuals' personally identifiable information, or PII. The explosion of this type of data in the world today, particularly PII, along with the digital nature of its existence, have really exponentially increased the risks to individuals' privacy, security, and financial safety. This heightened risk has led us to consider the ethical implications of the way that we use data. Ethics in this context can be defined as the moral principles that govern a person's behavior with respect to the storage, the collection, the dissemination, the processing, the collation, and curation of data. This goes well beyond doing what is legal, which is necessary, but not necessarily sufficient, to doing what is right, even when no one is watching, even if it costs more money or takes more time. The legal use of data is regulated differently in different jurisdictions, with each jurisdiction requiring compliance to its particular laws and regulations. But this gets complicated in an interconnected world where most of us, companies and organizations, operate globally. Given the internet, given the global nature of most businesses, it's impossible for data to retain and be retained within one geographical entity. So data ethics, therefore, has evolved as a new branch of ethics that studies and evaluates moral problems related to the generation, recording, curation, processing, and use of data. The ethical use of data cannot be regulated. And while it is critical to have regulation to set initial parameters, we really must rely upon individuals and organizations to go beyond what is regulated and what is legal, and encourage and sustain it through the personal accountability and moral ownership of the ways that we use data.
Fascinating description. So in this same kind of starting very broadly, Francesca, let's shift over to you before we open it up maybe for even some brief discussion from some of our other panelists. But Francesca, if you could guide us through the question of, are artificial intelligence, AI ethics, different from what Shaheen just described as data ethics? And if they are different, share with our world leaders how they are different.
Thanks. So AI ethics has to do with finding responses to, and in the form of principles, policies, commitments, actions, standards, laws, and so on, to concerns that many different people, many different stakeholders may have about the impact of AI in our society. So one of those concerns, of course, is since AI and especially machine learning approaches use a lot of data and also personal data. So one of the main concerns is what is going to happen with the data, how it's going to be used, and all the issues that Shaheen talked about. But besides that, AI ethics is also concerned with how the algorithms themselves that use that data for making predictions or recommendations or even autonomous decisions are going to act using from the input data to the final output, whether it's a decision or a recommendation. So what are the properties of these algorithms? What are the ways that they are developed, whether they are fair or not, according to some notion of fairness that is suitable for the deployment scenario, whether they are robust enough or they degrade their accuracy a lot as soon as you change the data distribution, whether they are explainable, because without explainability, they cannot build this ecosystem of trust between humans and the machine. And this also is another issue. So how is the human and machine interaction built in a way to get the best effective overall system for these algorithms, as well as concerns about the impact of this society that is becoming so pervasive in our life, in our society. So the impact onto the way we live, the way we function, the way we interact with others, and also the way we work. So the impact of AI on jobs. So there are all these issues that raise questions, and the AI ethics community, which is very multidisciplinary and multi-stakeholder, tries to find responses. But as I said, some of the responses are technical, but mostly they are socio-technical, because these are all socio-technical problems that cannot be solved only with technical solutions. And I agree, just as Shaheen said, that everything is beyond compliance to some regulation, because regulations are different in different regions of the world, and because companies should rather decide and make more commitments according to their own values and the values of their own ecosystem, partners, clients, and so on.
Holly, you seem to be kind of nodding there on the screen. Anything you want to add?
Yes, it's so interesting, isn't it? I think AI ethics gets a lot of the media interest. If you think about when data goes mainstream, when every day people talk about it, dinner party conversations and whatnot, it's often because something bad has happened. And I think that's a real challenge with data ethics and AI ethics. It's more than just bad things happening with data. Ethics can be about good versus good or right versus wrong. And I think some of the media interest around data and AI ethics is all about people doing bad things with data. But I think the challenge for organizations is how can we help what the right thing to do? And the right thing isn't always a choice between good versus bad, right versus wrong. I think that's a really important point we kind of need to keep in mind. It's everything you do with ethics, everything you do with data has an ethical consideration. It's not just about bad, awful things. It's about your whole organization, how you think, how you act, and as individuals, how are you happy about how your data is being used, consumed, against you, with you, and the everyday decisions that you make with your personal data. So it's more than just AI ethics, data ethics. It's about how we as individuals and organizations kind of interact with this data-rich world we're all part of.
Yeah, I think one of the critical things about what Francesca and Holly have both said really highlights the significant difference between data use in what we call structured or traditional data versus unstructured data or AI and machine learning data. And that is, the problems are usually intentional in the use of structured data. So you have people committing fraud by misusing data deliberately, or insurance fraud or other kinds of fraud. In the case of AI and machine learning, very often the harm caused to individual is unintentional on the part of the user because of potential bias that was unknown in the data sets, regardless of how large it is. And these are the unintentional consequences of data usage in the machine learning and AI world that are particularly onerous and I think and difficult to deal with.
So that is a great way, Commissioner Conway, for us to pivot and bring you into the conversation, because consumers, as we all know, regardless of the nation that we're from, consumers place their trust in insurers to be there in a time of need. And regulators have the duty to make sure that insurers are not only solvent, but also act ethically. So as we move deeper into this new world of data, Commissioner Conway, could you share with our viewers what some of the roles are that regulators are currently playing in making sure that these goals that were just talked about are being met, both in the United States and from your perspective, if you want to share worldwide any information?
Yeah, Matthew, and I want to actually go back to something that Francesca said, because I think it's core in your question, but it's also core in the answer to your question. And to me, it is all about trust, right? And it's the ability for, and really the requirement for regulators to step in and make sure that the regulations that they're putting in place are built upon and getting to a place where we can actually make sure that we do have trust in our insurance regulatory scheme and our insurance companies as well, both from the solvency side, and that's obviously a vital component of what we do when we're regulating insurance companies, but also from this kind of big data machine learning algorithm point of view. It's that we're on the verge of really starting to kind of grapple with that, I think, and get our arms around it on the insurance regulatory front in the States, at least, of how we're going to actually make sure that we are building trust with our insurance companies, with their big data system, with their algorithms, with the public and insurance companies, that is. On the solvency side of things, the solvency aspect, I think big data, machine learning algorithms, I think you're going to start to see that, and you've already started to see that come into our viewpoint and our advantages as we look at climate change in particular, and how we're using modeling from climate change and the big data systems that are developing around climate change modeling, and how that could potentially impact solvency. But that isn't kind of where the rubber is going to meet the road on the trust component of this. Where the rubber is going to meet the road on the trust component is where we're starting to see the states turn their viewpoint to, where we're starting to see states try to grapple with their big data systems, the algorithms that we don't have the expertise in-house to really grapple with. So we're going to have to find a different way to regulate those big data systems or algorithms to make sure that they are fair, to make sure that they are equitable for the public. And that's going to be a tough road to hoe. There are a lot of tough conversations that are going to come down on that front. But in order to make sure that we're building that trust that Francesca, I think, is absolutely right about, that we have to have between consumers and insurance companies, we're going to have to find a way to regulate it. We're going to have to find a way to make sure that it is being used fairly, and it is resulting in equitable results for folks.
And in a few minutes, we're going to go a little bit deeper into some of the really groundbreaking legislation, at least in the United States, that Commissioner Conway, you helped guide through in Colorado, and that have become law there. But before we do that, Francesca, let me turn the conversation back to you for a moment. In September of last year, the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud released a major study on artificial intelligence. One of the things that study told us as we surveyed our members is that they felt AI would be the single biggest factor in driving change in the fight against insurance fraud in the decade ahead. Now, I doubt if that overly surprised anyone, and I doubt if anyone around the world today joining us doubts the impact of artificial intelligence on the fight against insurance fraud. But the question we'd like to throw to you is why? Why is this such a monumental change that we're seeing right now in the fraud fight that will define more than the economy or anything else for at least the next decade to come, the fight against insurance fraud around the world?
As Shahid said, I mean, the amount of data that we are immersed in is really growing, and in the last few years grew, and also the amount of kinds of data, structured data, text, geographical data, unstructured data of various kinds, images, videos, natural language. Fraud detection and discovery and in prevention and inspection is a typical data embedded problem. It's a problem where data is all overwhelming. So the kind of data that is being generated, first of all, is really growing at unprecedented rates. And so the data that can be used to being analyzed and then to do, prevent, discover, and inspect whatever happened in a possible, case for fraud. So this is really the kind of problem where AI techniques, whether it's machine learning or combined with other kinds of techniques, they can behave well. As we said, however, we have to be careful because we know all the possible things that can go wrong in starting from data and not in using more traditional forms of algorithms where we tell the machines exactly what to do, one step after the other one. So with machine learning, we rely on the analysis of data, so we may not be aware explicitly of the bias of the other things that can be embedded into those algorithms and fraud detection and inspection, prevention, and so on. So that's why we have to be particularly careful about detecting bias, mitigating, being aware of what are the real, what we are really telling the machine to do without explicitly telling them. So this is really a data problem like no other, I think, a multimodal data problem. So we need advanced techniques like AI can provide to solve it.
Shaheen, you look like you might want to add something there, watching your face for a moment.
No, that's absolutely true. And luckily for us, I think everyone agrees to this, and data scientists, and in some cases, even individuals who are not necessarily AI experts like Francesca and others, but those who are users of large amounts of data, sometimes they're called citizen data scientists. They are becoming more and more aware of the pitfalls of operating with algorithms as black boxes. So we are trying to make AI algorithms more and more explainable or interpretable, if you will, because some of the problems with these black boxes is that they are not explainable, or they seem to come up with idiosyncratic results that were unexpected, but you don't know if the unexpected result is in fact a true result or a kind of correlation that actually has no causation. Because when you're operating with huge amounts of data, you can get problematic correlations that are actually not indicative of any kind of causations. And we are aware of the sort of the examples of Amazon trying to make their hiring practices more objective and gender neutral, but their AI algorithms only had examples of white male managers. Consequently, in selecting new candidates, they rejected women and people of color. And I could give you many other examples, which, as Holly mentioned earlier, it is these negative examples that get the press these days. But in reality, the implications of using algorithms can be devastating if one doesn't understand where the results come from. So I really think it's very important for AI specialists to work with the users of AI algorithms to understand what the context of the various data sources are and how these various contexts impact the output. And I think it is only this communication and collaboration between the data collectors and data users and the algorithm makers and those who actually implement these processes. So if you will, the business users plus the technical AI specialists, unless there is hand-to-hand collaboration and communication between the two of them, I think we are in danger of getting into more and more unintentional consequences of algorithmic sort of free fall.
Matthew, if I can just connect two things that Shaheen said, in both the answer to the first question and this one just now, that I think are absolutely vital, that insurance companies have to take the time, even if it takes a little bit longer, to do exactly what she just said, to be able to understand what's happening in their black boxes, to be able to explain what's happening in their black boxes, and to make sure that the correlation that they think is the result of their black box is actually a true correlation to some level of risk. And it's not just a correlation to other factors that have absolutely nothing to do with risk. So I couldn't agree more with what Shaheen just said there.
Wonderful. So Holly, let's pull you into the discussion here for a moment. And I'm fascinated by a comment you made a few moments ago about not all issues being good or bad as we look at data and data ethics. So in identifying fraud earlier in the process, even up at the underwriting stage, higher detection levels, obviously cost savings, all of these are things we hear both in the United States and around the world driving insurers to use data more across the board and specifically in the area of fighting insurance fraud. So why don't you lead us into discussion of what are we missing though? So what would you say, Holly, are the biggest risk or impediments that are faced in using big data, artificial intelligence as an anti-fraud tool around the world?
That's a great question, Matthew. And I think for me, it comes down to it's decisions, that not data, that creates value. So it's the action you take from a decision that creates or protects value for an insurer. You know, having real-time data, analytics, all the really cool new tech you could possibly want doesn't enable meaningful, tangible action unless you can make decisions on the back of them. And that's what ethics is about, making decisions. And I think for me, there's two things which aren't about technology, which I think all organizations, particularly insurers, need to think about. The first of all, exactly to Shaheen's point, you know, this concept of around the whole organization using data. You know, there's this massive buzz phrase around data-driven organizations. I think there's something in that about how do you enable everyone in your organization, not just your data scientists or your kind of advanced data users, sort of understanding how data is used, not necessarily kind of understanding and getting into the big black box, but really understanding that decision they've been given from a computer or, you know, an algorithm or the data they're asking for, having some understanding about what it is. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to go and get, you know, a PhD in maths. I'm talking about organizations investing in data comprehension, in basic data skills, so the whole organizations can have meaningful conversations. For me, ethics, particularly data ethics, has to be a whole conversational piece. It can't just be something that some people go and discuss. That's how you ensure, you know, that everyone acts in a similar way within an organization, that one person's ethics don't drive how an organization works or how you can have those checks and balances. So I think for me, it's about how do you talk about data? How do you talk about ethics, algorithms, without using technical jargon? And for me, it's how organizations really work with their human resources functions and their learning and development to put data training front and central for an organization. You can't say you're a data-driven organization if you're not investing in your data capabilities the same way you would your leadership capability. And second, it's around data foundations. Again, you know, you can have really great conversations around data, but you've also got to make sure you're prioritizing all those data basics, data quality, data foundations, legacy technology. It's about balancing the boring tech, you know, the stuff that perhaps isn't going to kind of get you some snazzy more funding or isn't going to really entice your shareholders, about prioritizing those behind the scenes basics as well. And then front and center your people. If your people don't understand how the decisions are being made, you're not going to create or protect value. You're just having a chat about data.
Fascinating. Commissioner Kawa, you seem like maybe you had something you wanted to add there.
So I think it's what was standing out to me, both in what Holly said there and what she said earlier, is that the transparency aspect of all of this, right? And it's she was talking there about the transparency aspect within the organization, but it's also outward transparency too, so that consumers really kind of connecting it back to what Francesca was saying earlier about the trust aspect, right? The transparency in all of this is so key across the board. But I think Holly's absolutely correct that having a level of basic understanding within the organization so that the people that come and have to talk to me as the regulator, they're not going to be the PhD folks in the background that are doing all of the work of building the algorithms, building the machine learning. But the folks that come and talk to me that are trying to explain this have to be able to give some level of assurance that what they're doing has been tested and that it's not going to be harmful to folks. And they can't do that if they don't understand what it is that they're actually talking about. So I think Holly's absolutely correct.
And we're going to do a dive into that, Commissioner, in just a moment, of exactly that issue. But before we get there, Francesca or Shaheen, anything you want to add on the risk and the impediments to the use of data and artificial intelligence?
Well, I would agree that, as I said earlier, these are socio-technical problems. So the technical part, in some sense, is the kind of easy part. The social and people part, educating the people, creating a culture within the company on what it means, people with different roles, of course, each one is his own roles, what it means to embed, ethical, solutions into a product that is being developed, or into some, internal process that is being defined. So the culture change, the multi-stakeholder discussions are, fundamental in achieving a good result.
Anything, Shaheen, that you wanted to add?
Sure, I totally agree. I also think that it's really important here for, sort of regulation is key in this. Regulation is critical, and it's a necessary prerequisite to bringing data risks under control in our day-to-day use. But I think we also have to acknowledge it's not sufficient by itself. Firstly, because of what I had already mentioned about the fragmented nature of regulation across countries and geographies, whereas data in reality, as we all know, moves sort of seamlessly across geographies. So until we have a global way of regulating, and not just regulating, but monitoring and enforcing regulation, which I think we are very far from being, and we may never actually get there because nation states are not going to be willing to give up their sort of, national pride and so on and so forth. We need to go beyond regulation. So even though regulation is a necessary prerequisite, I think we really need to go beyond to what both Francesca and Holly have mentioned, and that is ensuring that every user of data is accountable for the ethical and moral implications of what they are personally doing with the data. We have to remember that data is not an impersonal object, that even though it sounds fascinating and scientific and sort of very impersonal to think about using millions and millions of bytes of data, the problem is that all of these data have at its core an individual. The data is about a person at the heart of it. And we have to keep the person at the center of the discussion, and how the uses of data and the misuses, both intentional and unintentional, how it impacts individuals.
Excellent information. And the reason for our worldwide attendees, this is the only question you've really heard all four of our panelists discuss and talk about, and the risk, the impediments. And the reason for that is we're now going to pivot in our global panel discussion today. And Commissioner Conway, we're going to go to you. As was just discussed, not only do we have a patchwork of worldwide regulation, but in the United States, for our worldwide attendees, we have a patchwork within the United States in that insurance is regulated at the state level, not at the federal level. So at a bare minimum, we have 50 of the United States plus the District of Columbia, where the coalition is headquartered, that all have different insurance laws. So not only do we have a worldwide patchwork, we have a US patchwork. But in the year 2021, Commissioner, the state of Colorado has specifically stood out with two very interesting bills that you were involved in that were passed by the legislative leaders in Colorado, signed by Governor Paulus into law. One of those dealt with the what I'll call more traditional aspect of cybersecurity and protecting consumer data. The other was a lot more groundbreaking, and it dealt with data usage by insurers, biases in programming, those types of things. So we wanted to pivot to you first as a leader here in the United States, and the United States being looked at as a world leader. So would you tell our attendees a little bit about those two unique bills that have both now become law in the state of Colorado and how they impact on this whole question of data ethics?
Sure, Matthew, glad to. So the first one, you're right. It had more of kind of the traditional aspects of some of the issues that we've talked about. Shaheen was really talking about PII information at the beginning of the conversation. And we passed some laws in Colorado to kind of build around different PII components, both how we are sharing data internally within the state, and then also how we're sharing data with the federal government, in particular as it relates to immigration status for Coloradans. That's obviously a key conversation in the states just in general. But the one that got more attention was Senate Bill 169 in Colorado. And that was a bill that my department, that we were out in front of, that we led the charge on. And it was really built around the similar kind of the concepts that we've been having the conversation about all day, Matthew. It's built upon kind of the foundational aspect of that we need insurance companies to be certain that they understand, or to their greatest ability, understand what their machine learning, understand what their black boxes are doing and how they're impacting not only individuals, as Shaheen was talking about, but communities as well. Because there's a growing sense, a growing level of urgency, I think, amongst regulators in the states, that some of this machine learning, some of these algorithms that are out there, one, that the insurance companies may not be able to fully understand or explain what is happening with them, but that they're having negative impacts on communities and individuals as well. So the law that we passed kind of starts with that framework. And it also starts from the understanding, candidly, that it's going to be very difficult for us as state regulators to keep up with the insurance companies when it comes to machine learning, when it comes to algorithms. So knowing that we are going to need to make sure that we're building that trust that we were talking about earlier, that Holly has talked about quite a bit. We wanted to make sure that we were building a regulatory system that was requiring the insurance companies to use the tools that they have to do some stress testing and look at their algorithms, look at their machine learning to make sure that they aren't having negative impacts on communities or individuals. It's going to come down to a regulatory fight at this point, right? So the structure of the bill is there. The structure of the bill requires insurance companies to do stress testing, to look at their algorithms and their machine learning to see if the correlation that they think is connected to risk is actually connected to risk. And then very importantly as well, if it's connected more to protected classes of people, and if it's having a negative impact on protected classes of people as a result of that. So we're going to be in the midst of the regulatory discussion going into next year. Our regulations won't be able to become effective until January 1st, 2023. But we really tried to take a step back, Matthew, take more of that kind of 120,000 foot view approach rather than going after specific rating factors, which has really kind of been the approach that states have tried up to this point. Going after rating factors like credit scoring or education or income along those lines. Those have been more difficult for states to get legislation through on. And we wanted to take a more global approach where we're asking insurance companies to do exactly what we've been talking about throughout the discussion today, to make sure that they're not harming people.
And certainly the state of Colorado has been a leader both in the United States and I believe around the world in taking a step like that. And for our other panelists and for our attendees, one of the interesting things about the Colorado law is it puts the burden on insurers to bring forth that evidence that there is not intended or unintended bias in the programs. Holly, I kind of saw you nodding your head there and engaging when Commissioner Conway was talking about the new laws in Colorado. Anything you want to add on that topic?
Yeah, so I think it's quite a hard time, I think, for organizations. So there's lots of, and regulators alike, and there's lots of different definitions around AI. We're all still kind of muddling through it, as I think, as Shaheen and both Francesca alluded to, lots of definitions. If you type data ethics into Google, kind of get 3.2 million different results, like from kind of really simple, kind of elementary school type definitions, to kind of like these huge PhD kind of documents. And I think there's a really key role for the regulator about being, or regulators around the world, about kind of sharing best practice. I think we're all in this space together, trying to working out what we can and what we can't do. We all know AI and data is quite brittle. Things change quite quickly. I think it's a great role for the regulator in, helping to think about innovation as well in this space, about kind of sharing best practices, calling out organizations that are perhaps doing risk management in a really effective way. Because I think there's something about, this is not just about the competitive side of organizations, but as we keep talking about trust and citizens, about our data, I think the more we can do kind of collectively to share what's going well, I think the more like we can have those conversations. And when instances of things that are really wrong, things that are done not just because of, and when of the actions of bad behavior or deliberate misuse, it makes it far easier to talk about this is wrong and this is better practice when we're talking about what is good practice. So I'm really excited to see, around the world, how different regulators are promoting that, how they're championing and sponsoring and really calling out those organizations that recognize their learning, but wanting to share how they're doing it. So I'm quite excited for the next couple of years.
Wonderful. Okay, so we talked about Colorado here in the United States. Let's pull in our other panelists, though, and let's talk a little more internationally here. And Francesca, I'm going to start with you in a moment. But in addition to what Commissioner Conway was just describing and what the new laws are in the state of Colorado, in April, the European Commission released a draft of the new regulation that's being proposed on artificial intelligence. And in many ways, that quite lengthy, voluminous document goes a lot further than what around the world we know as the GDPR, dealing with privacy. So the AI rule appears to even be broader than GDPR. So Francesca, if you would lead us in a discussion of the question of what role should regulators and insurers be playing together on the international platform as we begin to look at more expansive use of AI, predictive modeling, and the appropriate guardrails to put in place, as we've talked about, with its role in fighting insurance fraud today. So would you start us off on that discussion?
Sure. So definitely the very short answer is that they should co-define together the appropriate regulations. They should educate each other or what are the real risks, and then define, considering those risks, define the appropriate regulation. The way I see this draft regulation proposal from the European Commission, which is informally called the EU AI Act, is like GDPR was in some sense providing an implementation of data ethics, an operationalization of data ethics that relied on the notion of very specific rights for the data subject, and then how do we protect those rights with this regulation. This EU AI Act is trying to operationalize AI ethics. So it's trying to say, what are the levels of risks that I see in using AI in our society? Some people that have looked at it may have noticed that there is a level which is called unacceptable risk, meaning this risk is too high, these things cannot be deployed in Europe, and there are some applications there. Others level, the second level of risk is very high risk, and then low risk and no risk. But especially for the high risk, there are many categories, I think 8 of them, areas. And so the important thing is there, that the European Commission tried, after extensive consultation, to understand what can be high risk, what should be put in that list of high risk applications. And notice that I talk about application because this regulation is not about regulating AI as a technology, but is regulating AI systems. So when you already take the AI technique and have an intended use purpose for that AI, you transform it into a system and an application for that AI technique. So defining what is really risky together with the appropriate, stakeholders. And then, for example, out of these 8, one I think that is relevant here. So there are many, like the one is the area of HR, another one is the area of private or public essential services. And so there may be something there that is related to what we are talking about today in this panel. And though if one fits in those applications, then there are a lot of obligations for the provider, which is the entity that is going to put the system onto the market, starting from registration in a public registry, European, to many other obligations that have to do with making sure that you are deploying with that AI system the so-called trustworthy AI in the European terminology, which is AI, which is fair, explainable, blah, 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 all these other properties. And then also obligations for the users, because again, it's a bilateral thing. It's not just the provider that provides the technology for some other company, but also the users of this technology. So overall, I think the co-regulation, co-education is important. One other thing to notice is that this regulation proposal wants to be future-proof in the sense that it allows for possible addition to the list, for example, to the high-risk list of high-risk applications, if in the future there are other high-risk applications that are going to be considered and co-decided together.
Holly, look like you might want to add something.
So I think there's just for me, it just reiterates this point about best practice. The more you're hearing about different organizations, different facets, it's very complex. And I think, we have to remember that lots of organizations do have experts in-house. They do have their own legal teams, their own information solicitors, expert data people. There are also some very small organizations who perhaps don't have that as well. So I think it's just about kind of sharing, talking, and the language we use is so important in this space. I think sometimes my biggest concern, sometimes in the AI space, is that the language we use can become so complex so quickly that actually it can be quite hard to follow the conversation or the whole organization. So it's very easy then to kind of go down rabbit holes. So I think there's a real importance around being really clear about terminology and language, and actually being able to say, actually, are we all on the same page? Do we all understand what we're talking about here? Because otherwise we're not going to be able to kind of interpret regulations, laws in the way they're meant to be.
So Shaheen, let's pull you into the conversation here. Insurance is all about risk and taking risk on a calculated basis. So we're talking now at this phase of the panel about what are the appropriate guardrails for regulation of this exciting new data tool, ability to use artificial intelligence, predictive modeling to fight fraud. But when we look at the concept of risk, both from a consumer perspective and from an insurer perspective, what are the risks that we face with either a result where this industry is overregulated, too much pressure, or not regulated enough? So from where you see on the world perspective, looking at what we talked about in Colorado, looking at the European Commission, the GDPR guidelines, the new AI guidelines, what's the right balance? And what happens to consumers and insurers if that correct balance is not achieved?
This is a fascinating question, Matthew, and I think all of the panelists would probably agree it's very hard to achieve that right balance. In a sense, we really have to be completely precise about avoiding both under-regulation and over-regulation. Under-regulation, I think, is automatically insufficient because we don't have guardrails against obvious instances of misuse, deliberate fraud, or intentional misuses through through misuse of data. But we also have a problem of overregulation, which may stifle creativity, which may lead to the inability to the innovative and legitimate and good uses, the good new uses of data that Holly was referring to earlier. We need to be able to use these powerful new tools, but we need to understand the full implications of using them. And I think my colleagues on the panel have already addressed most of this in terms of understanding the risks, both for the user, the consumer, and insurers. We have to be certain that the data that is being collected is legitimately being collected, so that we are not over collecting data that is not necessary. We have to be sure that the data that is being stored is legitimately being stored, that we are not saving data for the sake of aggregating massive amounts of data about our customers or our citizens, that we are only saving that data which is necessary. But third, we need to be sure that when we use this data, we really understand the nature of the data sets that we are using. And the nature of the data sets requires an understanding not only of the technical aspects of predictive modeling and AI. So we need the data scientists, we need the PhD level folks who really understand the complexities of the algorithms. We also need to bring in the perspectives of people who understand the business context, people who understand how this data is collected, how this data is used, what the implications of collection of this data is going to be. And I really cannot emphasize enough how we need to have more global dialogue on this, because everybody is anxious about this. And in the United States, as you know, we have a hodgepodge of regulation, some of it excellent, with Colorado being out in the front, but we also have HIPAA protecting medical information, and we have, other kinds of data protection information. And then we have the European Union going off on its own. We really need to make this a global effort, because this data is transferring back and forth. And I knew we couldn't avoid this panel without bringing in COVID at one point, but the transmission of the COVID-19 virus has demonstrated to us we live in a world without borders. And to date, we have not really understood or accepted the fact that data today operates in a world without national borders. And we haven't really come to grips with that.
Matt, can I jump in for just a minute on this question?
I'm actually glad you did, because I was going to turn to you next, since you, Commissioner, are our only panelist that really works in the governmental setting directly, where citizens put their faith and trust. They do it in insurers as well. We know that. But yes, please weigh in from your perspective, Commissioner.
Yeah, so I want to go back to it, something that Francesca said as well about insurers and the regulators working together to kind of create the best regulatory structure that you possibly can. What we found in Colorado is that that we are a long ways behind having those conversations in the States, just in general. The European Union is far more advanced than we are in those conversations. I got, on a constant basis, to give you a kind of a candid reflection of how far behind I think we truly are in the States. On a constant basis, I got as an attack against our legislation the idea that data itself is unbiased. So how could there possibly be any particular problem with an algorithm that's using unbiased data? It's just a laughable comment, but it seems so ingrained in the kind of in the thought process of the folks that were trying to defeat our legislation. It seems so ingrained with the insurance companies when I would have the conversations. It really reflected to me that we were a long ways, and we are a long ways behind in the conversations and the base level of understanding of how potentially dangerous these algorithms, these black boxes, these machine learnings are if we're not using them properly, and how awesome they could be if we're actually doing the homework, if we're actually making sure and we're checking to make sure that there isn't bias in the outcomes that are resulting from the machine learning and the black boxes. But I think it's absolutely the case that we're going to have to figure out a way to work together between the regulators and the insurance companies and the states in particular, because I do think that if we do that, if we come together and we start to work together on finding solutions, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we'll look back on the Colorado law and we'll think that it was pretty basic and that we had a long ways to go, but at least it was a good foundational aspect of trying to have the conversation and move the conversation forward in the States. But we have to do that. If we don't do that, if we fall further and further behind of our European counterparts, I think 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we're going to find ourselves in a very bad place where I fear that machine learning algorithms, those black boxes just won't be allowed in the insurance space. And that would be a very, very bad outcome. And I think we need to work to avoid that outcome.
So Holly, let's pull you in on this, because when I read your biographical background at the start, you've done extensive work writing, consulting, lecturing, in large part to insurers and in the financial markets about this issue of data ethics and data regulation. All of you as panelists are world leaders in this discussion that we're having today, and you'll help shape the future for it. So Holly, when it comes to insurers, when it comes to for-profit insurance companies looking at the saving of money, using this to more quickly identify insurance fraud issues, all those in and of themselves are not bad. They're good things if they're done right. But what advice would you give specifically to insurance companies around the world that they need to be considering, looking at, and acting upon as they either roll out or look to fine tune these data programs that they are using in the fight against insurance fraud?
So my first tip would be, don't Google, what should my data ethics be? So I don't personally believe that you can kind of pop down to the shops and buy a standalone set of data ethics and plug and play. Nor do I believe you can borrow a meaningful set of data ethics from another insurer and kind of fingers crossed, hope for the best. For me, I'm passionate that data ethics to be a value add, to your point, Matthew, and really drive an insurance firm forwards, both, from a shareholder and profit perspective, but also from an organizational kind of sense of purpose perspective. It has to be an extension of your organization's kind of values and principles. So for me, the very beginning of an ethics conversation must begin with what are your core values, not your competitors, not kind of the next door insurance firm, but your core values. And I think that too often I know that kind of values can be seen as a set of platitudes, that never really make it past a glossy poster in an office. But however, if organizational values are really reflective of the culture, the insurance firm where they aspire to be, and how they try and kind of create value for those they serve, they can really be a powerful block for kind of data ethics conversations. Because as we've discussed today, ethics as a concept can be really high level and it can be super abstract, but the actions that we take off the back of data and artificial intelligence have real consequences. And it's that clear, traceable link between an organization and insurance values and the data-driven action that brings ethics to life, and really importantly, brings ethics down from being this ivory tower theoretical conversation into one that can drive real value for every person working for that insurer. And I think that's really important in those consequences of those difficult, grey versus grey situations, not necessarily, as we've discussed, right versus wrong, but those conflicts of right versus right. And I think being able to understand, thinking about that from your organization's perspective is what makes kind of ethics really powerful. And I think that's when you are really thinking about, the competitive, regulatory, institutional pressures, being able to have a meaningful conversation that's centered and structured around your values helps you understand what's right for your organization with the data that you have, that you're collecting, that you're safeguarding, is what helps you think about what you can and can't do. But similarly, I don't think data ethics can be a checklist. It's not really a list of what you can and can't do. It's about that clarity about what your culture is, your values, what you as an insurer are there to do, and understanding what that means for your data decisions. So I would advocate, get your organizational values out. First question, Are you happy with them? Are you happy for those to drive your data value? If the answer is yes, brilliant. Start that conversation. When you look at your values, what does that mean for your data? What's that extension point? And I think it's about a conversation. It's not necessarily an easy conversation, and you can't expect to be kind of in a meeting room, crack them out in a few hours, job done. It's an ongoing conversation. And I think, but for me, starting with your values is probably the best way to go.
So Francesca, I saw you kind of lean forward there before you just kind of lean back in your chair looking at this. Any perspective you want to add?
No, I agree completely. And the only word that was missing, but I think it was implied, is again the word of trust. So really, it's important to build this trust, because these core values are what you are communicating to other companies, to your clients. In the case of IBM, our clients are not individuals; they are other companies. But our business is based on the trust of our clients. And so without that, and what you are saying, Ollie, are all these ingredients that need to be put in place to build that level of trust, which is however consistent with the company's main values, that probably were the values of the companies even before AI or data was in the picture, right? And now they need to be they need to be implemented also in this new world where data and AI takes such a prominent role. So again, there are many forces. Of course, regulations, yes, of course, a company has to be compliant with regulation, but the ethics, as was said at the beginning by Jahin, really goes beyond. It should be kind of independent from regulation, because it really has to do with what is the role that your company is playing there, what you can give as a value to your clients, and what you want them to trust you with. And so that's the very important concept that companies need to remember.
I think that's excellent. And while all of us on the steering committee for the Global Insurance Fraud Summit hope that this program that we started in 2019 will continue to grow and become more important to world anti-fraud leaders, one power we don't have is to make any of you on this panel the world overseer of the future of data ethics in the world of insurance fraud. But we can come at least a little bit close in that until we gather together for the 2022 summit, allow each of you as we close out to share your own personal thoughts, ideas, dreams, or visions with today's worldwide audience on this issue of data ethics and regulatory oversight. So this is your opportunity to have the stage, talk to the world leaders from your own perspective on what you'd like to tell them individually on this important topic. And Commissioner Conway, I'd like you to begin if you would.
Sure. And I'm going to pivot off of what I was actually planning to say, Matthew, and go to the topic that seemed to have continuously cropped up as we've had the conversation today, and it's trust. And it's the foundational aspect, I think, of all of this. And it's really kind of the foundational aspect of the law that we passed here. We want to build trust, and I think it's vital for insurers to be building trust with consumers, but with their regulators as well. And there's a flip side to that coin too. Regulators, to the point that Francesca was talking about before, and Holly started to go down this path too. Regulators have an obligation to build trust with the insurance companies as well, and then also to make sure that the consumers have trust in the industry too. But I think that's what it's going to all come down to at the end of the day. It's that as you're putting your ethical obligations in place, as you're putting your foundational aspects out there, kind of starting from that core structure of what am I doing to build trust both with our regulators, but far more importantly, with consumers. I think if you're using that as your North Star, you're gonna land in a good spot. So Matthew, I think that's what I'd come back to.
Great advice. Shaheen?
I think I agree with everything my fellow panelists have said so far, but I would say that perhaps we need to start by agreeing on a clear strategy and guidelines for collecting, retaining, and using data on a global level, since data cannot realistically be contained within national boundaries. but that means that we must have communication between regulators across national boundaries so that regulations are consistent. It means we need communication between enforcement agencies across boundaries so that enforcement is consistent. But on top of this regulatory layer, we have to go back to this issue of trust, but also weave the notion of personal accountability and personal ethics in the way that we use data. We must ensure that we are engaging all the different stakeholders, since what is good for the user can also be good for the organization. And finally, it wouldn't be a bad idea to have a kind of an independent oversight of trust but verify, if you will, an auditing system for seeing how this is working out in the way it's playing out within insurance companies and other organizations that are heavy users of data.
Yeah, an excellent advice. Francesca?
Yes, I would, I mean, as a final observation, I would, I will make an obvious observation that technology, technological progress is, is a positive thing. But the ultimate goal is actually, a societal, individual progress, our advancement of our values, how much we know each other, what's the future that we want. So, and technological progress is a means to that end, is not the end. And so I hope that technological progress with that view can help companies and insurance in this specific case to really help human beings be better at detecting, yes, predicting and resolving, frauds, but maybe even at reducing the number of frauds, because overall, we would like, a society where frauds possibly are not there, right? So I think that that's this more holistic view of technological progress as something that supports our own human progress, and something that I think that this would be good, and is not necessarily separated from business, opportunities and business value.
And great aspirations there, Francesca, for all of us. So Holly, you get the opportunity here on the worldwide stage to have the last voice and share your thoughts on this topic.
A great position to be in. So for me, I suppose it's about really remembering that data ethics starts with a conversation. And it's all about making sure the issue at hand is discussed and importantly understood by everyone involved, and being really clear about what trade-off is being asked to be made. But also remembering it is complex, and it's about embracing that complexity and being really honest with yourself and your fellow kind of insurer colleagues. And you're not always going to get it right, and that's okay. But it's about understanding what you're doing and just starting that conversation.
Thank you. And so the International Regulatory Panel for our 2021 Global Insurance Fraud Summit draws to a conclusion. And if you thought I was exaggerating at the start of this session when I talked about the quality of the panelists that gathered together for today's session, you saw firsthand why I said everything that I said. So our thanks to all of our panelists today, our thanks to all of you around the world for joining this year's Global Summit and the Regulatory Panel today. Blessings to everyone, and we'll look forward to seeing you in 2022, hopefully back in person again. And that concludes this session.